The first thing Daniel did was sweep a crystal glass off the conference table and send it across the floor. It shattered near my shoes. Then he pointed at me with a shaking hand and said, "You don't get to walk in here and take what was supposed to be mine." I did not step back. I just looked at my son and kept my hands at my sides while security moved in from behind him. That was the moment I understood something simple. Olivia had died, but the lie she left behind had not died with her. And if you've ever stood in the same room with your own child and felt like a stranger, then you already know how quiet a man can become. 3 days earlier, I had been in my shop in Austin, Texas, planing the edge of a cedar board for a cabinet door. That was my life now, not the one I had started with. Not the one people once expected me to have. Just a small woodworking shop, a one-story house, and the kind of routine that asks very little from the world. I was 68 years old. My hands were rough. My back reminded me of my age every morning, and most of the people around me knew me as a carpenter, not an architect. That part had ended a long time ago. I had lost that career 20 years earlier, and I had learned not to explain why. Then my phone rang. I remember looking at the screen and seeing Daniel's name. For a second, I thought I was reading it wrong. My son had not called me in 20 years. Not on holidays. Not when he graduated. Not when he got his first job. Not once. I answered anyway. "Daniel." There was no pause on his end. "Mom is dead." He said it flat. No softening. No lead-in. No space to absorb it. I leaned one hand on my workbench and said, "What happened?" "Stroke," he said. 2 days ago. The shop went very still around me. I had not spoken to Olivia in years either, not in any real way. But death has a way of cutting through old distance. It makes even silence feel unfinished. I asked when the funeral was. "It's already handled," he said. Not, "was handled." "Is already handled," as if I had missed a delivery window. Then he told me the real reason he had called. There's a will reading in New York. Harrison wants everyone relevant there. I almost laughed at that word. Relevant. After 20 years, that was apparently what I was. He kept going before I could speak. "Don't get any ideas. You're not getting anything. Mom made that clear. She only wanted you there to hear it in person." I let him finish. He wanted me to hear that. He wanted me to travel across the country so I could sit in a chair and watch my own son enjoy the final humiliation of my life. That much was obvious. But underneath that, there was something else. He sounded impatient. Not grieving. Not shaken. Impatient. As if his mother's death had interrupted a schedule, and that was the first thing that stayed with me. I said, "What time?" He went quiet for half a second, like he had expected me to refuse. Then he gave me the address in Manhattan and the time for the reading. Before hanging up, he said, "Just don't make a scene." I looked at the cedar dust on my hands and said, "I never did." He ended the call without another word. I stood there for a long time after that, not because I was thinking about money. I had spent 2 decades living without theirs. I did not need a lecture from a dead woman written into a will, and I did not need $1 from Olivia Carter to tell me who I was. But I had lived 20 years inside a lie I was never allowed to correct. Daniel had grown up believing I betrayed his mother, damaged her company, and destroyed our family because I was careless, weak, or selfish. He had looked at me through that story for so long that it had become his truth. I had let it stand. Maybe that was my mistake. Maybe keeping the peace had simply made room for something worse. Tell me honestly, would you have gone? Because I knew exactly what waited for me in New York. Contempt, a polished office, a son who wanted an audience. And still, by the end of that day, I had booked the flight. I packed one dark suit, one white shirt, one tie I had not worn in years, and a pair of shoes I kept for funerals. There was not much else to take. When a man lives quietly long enough, he learns how little belongs to him. The flight to New York was uneventful. That almost made it worse. No warning, no interruption, just hours to sit with memory. Olivia and I had once built things together. That was the cruel part. Not romance, not even marriage. Work, plans, a shared appetite for control and risk. She had a sharper instinct for business than anyone I knew. I had the design training, the long view thinking, the patience for structure. Together years ago, we had looked like a solid pair from the outside. Then things shifted. Pressure changes people. Debt changes them faster. By the time our marriage ended, the version of events the world accepted was simple. Olivia was the one who kept the company alive. I was the man who had made reckless choices and dragged everything down. Simple stories travel well. That one certainly did. By the time Daniel was old enough to understand the adults around him, that story had already settled into place. And children do not challenge the version repeated with confidence. They live inside it. That still wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that I had helped build the silence around it. Not because I was guilty, because I thought I was protecting what was left. When I landed, Manhattan looked the same as it always had to me. Sharp edges, tall glass, people moving as if stopping might cost them money. I checked into a hotel near Midtown, laid my suit across the bed, and sat in the chair by the window until sunset. I did not call anyone. There was no one to call. The next morning I got dressed slowly, tie straight, shoes polished, face steady. The office of Harrison Legal sat high above the street, with quiet carpets and walls that seemed designed to keep emotion outside. A receptionist showed me to the conference room. Daniel was already there. He stood near the long table in a dark suit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage. He had Olivia's posture, that upright confidence, that expression that could pass for discipline when it was really contempt. Beside him stood Emily, his girlfriend, polished, alert, silent in the careful way people are when they know money is nearby. Ryan was there too, Daniel's financial advisor. He had the calm smile of a man who expected to be around a great deal more wealth by lunchtime. Daniel looked at me once, from head to toe, then back to Harrison's empty chair. "You came," he said. "You called." Emily gave me a brief nod and looked away. Ryan stepped forward first, offering a hand. "Ryan Mercer." I took it once and let go. "Michael Carter." Daniel said, "He knows who you are." His tone was not protective. It was dismissive, as if introductions were a waste in the presence of irrelevance. I took the seat farthest from him and set my hands on the table. Daniel stayed standing. "Just so we're clear," he said, "this doesn't change anything." I looked at him. "I didn't come to change anything." He gave a short laugh. "That would be a first." Emily shifted at that, but she did not say a word. Neither did Ryan. That told me something. People get very quiet when they believe power is settled. A moment later, Harrison walked in carrying a folder and a small sealed envelope. He was older than I expected, composed, and careful with his face. He greeted Daniel first, then me. "Mr. Carter, thank you for coming." Daniel said, "Can we get started?" Harrison took his seat. "In a moment." Then he placed the envelope on the table, not in front of Daniel, but near his own hand. Daniel noticed. So did I. And that was when the air in the room changed. Maybe I was wrong, but it didn't feel right. Harrison opened the file and began in the dry, formal tone people use when they are about to rearrange a family with paper. He started with the smaller bequests: money to Olivia's housekeeper, money to her driver, several charitable donations, specific amounts, cleanly stated, each one recorded with the kind of precision that makes everyone else in the room feel like they are waiting for the real sentence. Daniel leaned back in his chair and checked his watch. That detail mattered. He was not grieving. He was waiting for clearance. Emily touched his arm once and whispered, "Let him finish." Daniel said not quietly enough, "He's reading around the point." Harrison looked up. "I am reading the will as it was written." Ryan folded his hands and tried a mild smile. "Of course." Small exchange. Clear meaning. Daniel did not want the document read. He wanted the ending delivered. Harrison continued. Then came language that shifted the room. Olivia had included comments, a warning about Ryan's judgment, a statement that Emily's motives had not earned Olivia's trust. Not accusations. Just cold lines placed in a legal document by a woman who knew exactly what every sentence would do after she was gone. Ryan's smile fell first. Emily's face tightened. Daniel sat forward. "This is ridiculous," he said. "What is that doing in there?" Harrison said, "Your mother chose her wording carefully." Daniel gave a hard laugh. "She always did." The way he said it was not affectionate. It was irritated, as if even in death Olivia had become inconvenient. I watched Emily then. She had come into that room expecting to leave attached to a man whose life had just become much larger. Instead, she was hearing that Olivia had seen through her. Ryan had the same problem. Calculation interrupted. And that still was not the point of the reading. It was just the first crack. Harrison turned a page. Under the primary residential provisions, Olivia Carter leaves the Manhattan penthouse to her son, Daniel Carter. Daniel exhaled through his nose and leaned back again. There it was. The confidence returned immediately. Harrison continued. She also leaves to Daniel Carter her personal luxury watch collection, to be transferred in accordance with the inventory secured in her private safe. Daniel nodded once. That makes sense. No grief, no mention of his mother, just possession. Emily finally smiled. Ryan loosened his shoulders. For a moment they looked like people whose delayed flight had finally been called. Then Harrison reached into a box beside his chair and placed a small key on the table. Not in front of Daniel. In front of me. Nobody spoke for a second. Daniel looked at the key, then at Harrison, then at me. What is that? Harrison said, the key associated with the secured watch inventory. Daniel frowned. Why is it there? Because your mother directed that it be given to Michael Carter. I did not touch it. I only looked at the key lying on polished wood between my hands. A small object. Plain metal. No explanation attached. Daniel stared at me as though I had reached across the table and stolen it in plain sight. That doesn't make any sense. Harrison did not respond. Daniel's voice sharpened. Why would he have that? I finally said, You're asking the wrong person. At that moment, I did not know why Olivia had done it. But the key mattered. I could feel it before I understood it. Too deliberate. Too specific. Olivia had not left things like that by accident. Tell me this. Would you have trusted any of that? A dead woman leaves her son the penthouse and the watches, but hands the key to the man she blamed for ruining everything. That was not sentiment. That was structure. Daniel turned fully toward me. If you think this means anything, it means your mother wrote it down, I said. He pushed back his chair hard enough for it to scrape across the floor. Emily said, Daniel. Ryan added, Let's not overreact. That word landed badly. He sat down again, but only barely. His jaw stayed tight. Harrison continued reading. Formal language. Asset references. Administrative transfers. Daniel had stopped pretending patience. He interrupted twice more. Once to ask how much longer this would take. Once to say we all know where this is going. Harrison ignored both interruptions. Then he reached the section that carried my name. Under Article 9, Olivia Carter leaves to Michael Carter the sum of $15. Daniel laughed out loud. Not a quick breath of disbelief. A full laugh. He leaned back and looked at Emily, as if the room had finally given him the line he had been waiting 20 years to hear. There it is, he said. Bus fare. Ryan smiled again cautiously. Emily said nothing, but I saw relief pass over her face. Daniel looked at me with open triumph. You hear that? $15. That's exactly right. I did not answer. Not because it did not sting. It did. There is something cruel about having your worth reduced to a joke in front of strangers. But Daniel mistook silence for defeat. He always had. He said, You came all the way here for bus money. I looked at him and said, Seems your mother had one last performance in her. That made Harrison glance up. Daniel smirked. You finally figured that out? I had known Olivia long enough to hear the false ending in that room. The key had already told me so. The comments about Ryan and Emily told me more. Olivia was not just distributing property. She was arranging a sequence. And Olivia never arranged a sequence without a reason. The $15 were not the message. They were the pause before it. At the far end of the table, Harrison closed the first folder. Daniel straightened, satisfied. Good, he said. Now that that's done. It is not done, Harrison said. The room went still. He placed his hand on the sealed envelope and opened a second document. Your mother executed a signed codicil shortly before her death. Daniel blinked once. What? A formal amendment to the will, Harrison said. I know what a codicil is. Why wasn't that mentioned first? Because I am handling this correctly. Daniel's face changed right there. Not fear yet. Loss of control. Ryan leaned forward. Was this witnessed? Yes. Properly filed? Yes. Ryan sat back, but his silence had changed too. Emily stared at the paper in Harrison's hand as if she could force it closed. Daniel said, Read it. Harrison nodded once. Attached to the codicil is a letter from Olivia Carter, with instructions that it be read in full. Daniel muttered, Of course there is. I looked at the envelope again. 20 years earlier, Olivia had controlled the story by saying nothing. Now she intended to control it by saying everything. And that was the moment the past stopped feeling buried. It felt loaded, because once a lie starts to break in public, it does not break cleanly. Harrison unfolded the letter and began, To my son Daniel and to Michael. Only those two names. The room seemed smaller all at once. I have allowed a false story to stand for 20 years. Daniel shook his head immediately. No. Harrison kept reading. I allowed my son to believe that his father betrayed this family, damaged my company, and destroyed our future. Daniel stood up. No. Stop. Harrison did not stop. In truth, the danger came from my company's financial condition and from decisions I approved. Ryan went pale first. Emily whispered, Daniel. He did not hear her. Harrison continued. Michael Carter undertook high-risk transactions to keep the company from collapse. When the authorities began investigating, he accepted responsibility and allowed his own name, license, and career to be destroyed in order to protect me, the company, and our family. For the first time since I had entered that room, Daniel looked at me as though he were seeing my face and not the role he had assigned me. I did not move. The floor beneath 20 years of silence had just shifted, and nothing in that room was stable anymore. You tell me, was I supposed to ignore that? Daniel stayed on his feet, one hand flat against the table. He looked from Harrison to me and back again, as if the room had started speaking a language he refused to recognize. That's not true, he said. His voice had changed, still hard, but thinner. Harrison went on reading. Olivia's words were plain. No dramatics, no self-pity. That was why they hit so hard. She admitted that 20 years earlier her company had been on the edge of collapse and under financial scrutiny. She admitted that the dangerous transactions had been done to save it. She admitted that I had stepped forward when the investigation closed in. She admitted that she had allowed everyone around us, including our son, to believe I was the one who had brought the damage into the family. And then came the line that froze Daniel where he stood. I let Daniel keep that belief because I was ashamed, and because the truth would have exposed what Michael had done for me and what I had allowed him to lose. Daniel looked sick, not emotional, disoriented. A man can survive anger for years if he believes he earned it. Take away the reason, and what remains is harder to carry. He said, She lied to me? Nobody answered him, because Olivia had not just lied to him. She had built his adult life around that lie. Every choice he had made about me, every judgment, every dismissal, every conversation he had refused, all of it now had a crack running through it. Ryan recovered before Daniel did. This only describes her view of past events. It doesn't change present asset structure unless the codicil specifically. It does, Harrison said. Then he turned the page. The room seemed to brace itself. Terminal. Emily put her hand over her mouth. Daniel stared. Harrison continued. All controlling interest in the company, all remaining major financial holdings, and all principal assets, collectively valued at approximately $160 million, are transferred to Michael Carter. No one moved. Then Daniel laughed once, a single broken sound. That's impossible. Harrison said nothing. Daniel turned toward Ryan. Say something. Ryan did not. He was reading the room now, not the document. That told me enough. A man loyal to money rarely stays loyal to the person who just lost it. Daniel looked at Emily next. She had already taken a step back from him, just one. But I saw it. That was when the power in the room shifted for the third time. First the key, then Olivia's letter, now the money. And with each shift, Daniel stood more alone. Harrison kept reading because that was his job. Daniel Carter is to receive the sum of $15 as his final inheritance. The silence after that line was different from the silence that followed my $15. Mine had been loaded with ridicule. His carried exposure, because everyone in that room understood what Olivia had done. She had mirrored the humiliation. For judgment, Daniel's face went red, then pale, then hard again. He pointed at me. You knew. I said, no. You came here knowing this. I came here knowing your mother wanted me in the room. That's convenient. It's also true. He slammed both hands on the table. 20 years. 20 years. And now suddenly she decides to turn me into the fool? Nobody answered, because the answer was already in the letter. She had left him living inside a falsehood for 20 years, and the room had merely removed the cover. He looked at Harrison. This won't stand. Harrison folded the papers carefully. It is executed lawfully. Ryan stood then, slowly, measured, like a man choosing the least expensive exit. Daniel, he said, this is significant. You should avoid making statements until everything is reviewed. Daniel stared at him. You told me everything was secure. Ryan did not deny it. The circumstances have changed. That was all. Not loyalty. Not support. Just distance. Emily gathered her handbag before Daniel even turned toward her. He noticed. Seriously? She swallowed and said, I didn't know any of this. Neither did I. That's not the point. That line hung in the air. She was telling him what mattered had changed. Not morally, Financially. He took one step toward her. So that's it? Emily looked down, then back up. I think you need to deal with your family. She left the room. No speech. No apology. Just the soft click of the door. Ryan waited less than 5 seconds after that. I'll be in touch once there's been time to assess the documents. Then he left too. Daniel watched the door close behind the last person who had entered that room on his side. And that was the first moment he looked young to me again. Not like a child, like a man stripped of the script that had been carrying him. I should have understood it sooner. He had never built his hatred of me from evidence. He had built it from inheritance, and now the inheritance had been moved. Would you have trusted him after that? Daniel turned back to me slowly. You let me believe it. There it was. Not grief. Not apology. A new accusation. Because some people will reach for blame before they will reach for truth. I said, your mother and I made choices. Mine was silence. He barked out a laugh. Silence? You let me grow up thinking you were trash. I know. And you did nothing. That is not the same as nothing. He stared at me as if he wanted the sentence to fail under its own weight. But it didn't. Silence can be guilt. It can also be sacrifice. The damage is that it looks the same from the outside. He walked to the window, then back to the table. You expect me to believe you ruined your own career for her? I don't expect anything from you. You took the fall? Yes. For her company? Yes. For her? Yes. The room held that final word for a moment. That was how old decisions sound when there is no use dressing them up. Daniel shook his head. That makes no sense. It doesn't have to make sense to you. It was your life. I know. He looked as if he wanted me to explain 20 years in 3 sentences. I had no intention of doing that for him. Harrison cleared his throat. There is one further instruction. Daniel whipped around. What now? Harrison reached into his briefcase and drew out another key. This one looked older, heavier. The metal was darker, worn at the edge. He placed it in front of me. Your wife directed that this be given to you only after all parties had left or the proceedings had concluded. Daniel leaned in. What is it? The actual safe key. The word actual seemed to land harder than the word million. Daniel pointed at the first key. Then what was that? A key to the watch compartment inventory. This one opens the document safe. I looked at the second key, then at the first. 2 keys. One public, one real. That was Olivia in a single gesture. She had used the first to disturb the room. She had saved the second to finish it. And suddenly the small metal object from earlier made complete sense. It had never been about the watches. It had been about timing. The key had become a message. Third time. Third meaning. Harrison continued. The safe contains records, correspondence, and financial documents related to the events addressed in the letter. Daniel stepped closer to the table. I want to see them. They are now Michael's property. Daniel looked at me with something raw in his face. Not only anger now, panic. Because a story can survive accusation, it usually cannot survive paperwork. That's my mother's company, he said. I answered, it was. He lunged then, not with a plan, just with the blind force of a man who had nothing left to control except volume and movement. His hand struck the crystal glass. It flew. It shattered near my shoes. And then he came around the table toward me. That was when security grabbed him, one at each arm. He twisted and shouted, you don't get to take this from me. I stood up at last. Not fast. Not threatening. Just enough to look him in the eye. I never took it from you, I said. You were handed a lie. He strained against the guards. Get out. I almost answered him. Then I realized the room had already done that for me. By then there was nothing left to prove in words. Would you have stayed quiet after that? Because I knew one thing with absolute certainty. The day was not ending with Daniel's anger. It was ending with evidence. Security dragged Daniel backward while his shoes scraped against the conference room floor. He kept twisting toward me, not because he thought he could still win, because he could not stand being seen losing. Let me go, he shouted. One of the guards said, Sir, stop resisting. Daniel did not stop. He jerked forward again and glared at Harrison. This is fraud. You hear me? Fraud. Harrison remained seated. No, he said. It is not. That calm answer made Daniel look even more unstable. People like him expect resistance. Calm gives them nothing to climb. He swung his head back toward me. You set this up. I said nothing. He barked out another laugh. Now you don't talk? I looked at him steadily. I have spent 20 years not being heard. I'm not going to waste breath while you're screaming. That landed. He hated that it landed. He pushed against the guards again. Everything in that letter could be a lie, Harrison said. The supporting records may answer that concern. Daniel froze for half a beat, because he heard the word records. Paper has a way of stripping drama out of a room. It leaves people with dates, signatures, transfers, and choices. And when a man has built his life on a story, records are dangerous. I want them now. Harrison looked at me, not at Daniel, at me. That told Daniel more than any speech could have. The authority had moved. The room knew it. Daniel knew it. That was why his face changed from rage to something darker. Humiliation. Maybe you see it differently, but I knew one wrong sentence could turn his collapse into an excuse. So I kept my voice low. Take him out. The guards did. He fought them all the way to the door. At the doorway, Daniel twisted one last time. This isn't over. Then the guards took him out into the hall, and the door shut. Silence settled over the room so suddenly that I could hear my own breathing. Broken glass glittered near my shoes. The first key still lay on the table. The second key lay beside it. For a moment, those two pieces of metal seemed to hold the whole day between them. The first key had opened confusion. The second key had opened truth. Harrison waited before speaking. Finally, he said, "Are you all right, Mr. Carter?" I looked at the closed door. I've been worse. That was true. A man does not lose a career, a marriage, and his son all at once without learning what worse feels like. Harrison nodded once. Then he slid a file folder toward me. Your wife wanted the records placed in your hands directly. I looked at the folder but did not open it yet. My fingers rested on the edge. I already knew what was inside in broad terms. Records of the transactions, evidence of what I had done, evidence of what Olivia had let stand. But there is a difference between knowing something happened and holding the paper that proves it. I said, "Did she say anything else?" Harrison took a measured breath. She said there was no point leaving an apology to the wrong person. I looked up at him. He held my eyes and continued. She said you paid for her survival longer than anyone should have had to. That was all. No dramatic flourish. Just 2 sentences, and somehow that made them heavier. I sat back down. The chair felt harder than before. I picked up the second key. It was colder than I expected. Strange thing to notice. But that is how the mind works when it has taken too much in at once. Cold metal. Sharp paper edges. Glass on the floor. I asked, "Where is the safe?" "In a private records room. Your wife instructed that it be opened only after the meeting concluded." I almost corrected him at the word wife. Then I let it pass. He stood and gestured toward the adjoining room. It was smaller than the conference room. No windows. A built-in wall safe behind a framed panel. He removed the panel and stepped aside. I inserted the key. For 1 second my hand stopped. There are moments when the past becomes physical again. That was one of them. I turned the key. The lock opened with a heavy click. Inside were document boxes, neatly labeled, dates, transaction references, internal memos, personal correspondence, not chaos. Order. Olivia had left the truth the same way she once ran a business. Organized. Harrison lifted the first box onto a table. I opened it. The top layer held copies of the transaction records. Below that were letters, some signed by Olivia, some by me, some unsigned internal documents tied to the company's financial distress. I did not need to read every page to know what they meant. I had lived them, but I read enough to see my name where it needed to be, enough to see the structure of the risk I had taken, enough to see the path that led to the investigation, enough to see the burden shift toward me by design. That was the thing no rumor had ever captured. It had not happened by accident. I had stepped into it deliberately, and Olivia had let me stay there. Paper is unforgiving. It does not care how noble a sacrifice looked 20 years ago. It only shows what was done and who paid for it. I turned one page and saw my old signature beneath language that once ended my architecture career. I stared at it for a long time. That signature had cost me more than income. It had cost me standing, identity, the future I had trained for. After that, I was no longer the man people called when they wanted a building designed. I became the man whose name had been attached to financial trouble and reckless judgment. Work disappeared quietly after that. Respect disappeared faster. I built furniture because wood does not ask what happened to you before it lets you shape it. Harrison stood back, giving me privacy while remaining present. I asked, without looking up, "Did Daniel know any of it?" "No. Your wife was very clear on that." I believed him. Daniel's anger had been too raw. A guilty man prepares. A deceived man erupts. That did not excuse him. It only explained the shape of the blow. I opened another folder. More proof. The company's exposure. The measures taken. My role. Olivia's approval. The trail was clean enough to settle any question about whether I had invented my own sacrifice. I closed the box. For 20 years, the truth had existed in one form or another. But truth locked away is just a delayed reckoning, and that was what Olivia had finally arranged. Not forgiveness. Reckoning. That still wasn't the end of it, because once those papers were in my hands, the question changed. Until then, the day had been about what Daniel and Olivia had done. Now it became about what I would do. Harrison said, "There are immediate matters requiring your decision." I looked at him, such as control of the company, public disclosure if any, estate administration, transfer authority. There it was, the practical side of justice, not applause. Responsibility, I asked. And Daniel? Harrison's face remained neutral. He is no longer in control of anything attached to the estate. I thought about that. Then I thought about the boy he had once been. Then the man he had become. Then the glass on the conference room floor. He had spent 20 years believing I was the weak one. In a single hour, he had lost his story, his audience, and his inheritance. That was punishment enough for the moment, but it was not resolution. Was I overreacting? I closed the lid on the document box and picked up both keys. The false key. The real key. One for appearances, one for facts. By then, I understood why Olivia had done it that way. She knew Daniel had lived by appearances. She knew I had lived under the cost of facts. At the doorway back to the conference room, Harrison said, "Do you wish to review more now?" "No, I know enough." He nodded. "Then the next steps are yours." That sentence stayed with me, because for 20 years, nothing about that story had felt like mine anymore. Now, suddenly, choice had returned. I returned to the conference room alone except for Harrison. The broken glass had been cleared. Daniel's chair stood empty. Ryan's chair stood empty. Emily's too. It was a cleaner room than the one they had helped create. That felt fitting. I sat down once more and placed both keys on the table in front of me. For a while, neither Harrison nor I spoke. At last he said, "You do not have to decide everything today." I looked at the folder near my hand. "No, but I have to decide something." That was the truth. A man can carry a lie for 20 years because he thinks endurance is the same as strength. Then one day the lie breaks open, and endurance is no longer the question. Action is. I thought about Olivia's letter. Not the money. Not even the company. The letter. What she had admitted. What she had finally chosen to put in writing. She had not left me love. She had not left me peace. She had left me proof and authority. For some men that would have felt like victory. For me it felt more complicated. There was relief in it, yes. Not joy. Certainly not triumph. Just relief that the ugliest thing done to my name had finally been named for what it was. I had spent 20 years being discussed as a cautionary tale. A failed architect. A reckless husband. A man who deserved to be kept at a distance. Now I held the record showing that the distance had been bought with my own sacrifice. That matters. A man can survive being poor. He can survive being alone. But being misnamed for decades changes the way the world sits on his shoulders. I asked Harrison, "Did Olivia say why now?" He considered the question before answering. She said death had removed the only excuse she had left. That sounded like Olivia. Not tender, not dramatic, just severe. I nodded once. For years I had wondered whether shame ever reached her in private. Now, I had my answer, and it was not comfort. It was information. Sometimes that is all a man gets. I stood and walked to the window. Manhattan moved below us without concern. Cars, pedestrians, deliveries. The city had no interest in whether one family had finally torn open an old lie. That helped. It made the truth feel less theatrical, more solid. I turned back to Harrison. "What happens if I say nothing publicly?" "The estate transfers proceed. You assume control. The records remain available should questions arise. And if I do say something, then the record can be established clearly." He left the rest unsaid. Public disclosure would restore my name. It would also expose Olivia fully and strip away the last shelter around Daniel's view of his mother. For 20 years he had hated me because he thought I had betrayed his family. Now he would have to live with the fact that the betrayal had begun much closer to him. I still wonder what you would have done. Would you have walked away with the money and let the dead keep their secrets? Or would you have opened the whole thing and let everyone see what it cost? I did not answer that question quickly. I thought about Austin, my shop, the smell of cedar and walnut, the clean honesty of work done by hand. I thought about the years after my architecture career ended, how people looked at me when my name came up, how some jobs disappeared without explanation, how invitations stopped, how Daniel, still young then, learned to look at me with embarrassment, before that embarrassment hardened into contempt. Then I thought about him in that room, his face when Harrison read the letter, his face when Ryan went silent, his face when Emily stepped back, his face when the $15 became his. Justice had reached him, but understanding had not. Not yet. Maybe it never would. A person can be given the truth and still refuse it. That choice belongs to them. I sat again and opened Olivia's letter one more time. I read only the first lines. I have allowed a false story to stand for 20 years. That sentence did not repair the years. Nothing could. It did not give me back the career I lost. It did not return the father-son bond that had been eaten away by silence. It did not make Olivia brave in life simply because she had finally become honest near death. But it did one necessary thing. It ended the debate over whether I had imagined my own sacrifice. No one would get to reduce my life to Daniel's version anymore. That still left one final decision. The company. $160 million and control over what Olivia had built and what I had once saved. Strange thing to sit in front of at 68. Not because I had never seen success, because I had already learned how quickly status can become smoke. Money does not erase time. It does not soften 20 years. It does not restore a son to the man he might have been. But it does give a man room to decide how much of his life will continue to be defined by damage done to him. And I was done being defined that way. I asked Harrison for copies of everything. He said they were already prepared. Of course they were. Olivia had planned the room. Harrison had planned the aftermath. I slid the documents into my leather case and took the real key last. The false key I left on the table for a moment. I looked at it. Small. Ordinary. Useful only because people thought it opened something valuable. In that, it had done exactly what a lie does. It gave shape to the wrong expectation. Then it failed. I picked it up too. I wanted both. The false key and the real one. The story people had believed and the story the records could prove. I put them side by side in my pocket. 2 weights. Very different meanings. Harrison stood as I reached for my coat. If you need to move quickly on the company, I can arrange the meetings. I know. If you choose public disclosure, I'll prepare the process. I nodded. He paused, then said, For what it is worth, Mr. Carter, your wife seemed certain about one thing. I waited. She believed you would know what to do once the truth was finally yours. I almost smiled at that. Not because it pleased me. Because Olivia had spent our marriage trusting my judgment most, when her own choices had already run out. I thanked Harrison and walked out. The hallway was empty. No Daniel. No voices. Just quiet carpet and the distant sound of elevators. When the doors opened in the lobby, the city met me all at once. Cold air. Traffic noise. People moving fast. I stood on the sidewalk in Manhattan with papers in one hand and more wealth than I had ever expected to touch again tied now to my name. And none of that felt as heavy as the truth. For a long minute, I did nothing. I thought about whether to call Daniel. I did not. Not then. The day had already said everything he was capable of hearing. Maybe later he would come looking for answers. Maybe he would come looking for blame. Maybe he would say I should have spoken sooner. He would be right about that much. But being late with the truth is not the same as being wrong, and I was finished accepting guilt that did not belong to me. So I made the first decision of my new life before I reached the corner. I would not hide the records. I would not let Olivia's confession stay sealed in private boxes while the old lie kept breathing in public. I did not need revenge. I did not need spectacle. I needed the truth where it could stand on its own. Clear. Documented. Final. Daniel could do what he wanted with that. Mourn it. Deny it. Learn from it. Waste it. That part was his. Mine was simpler. I would take control of what had been left to me. I would restore my name, and I would never again confuse silence with peace. When I reached the curb, I stopped once and looked back at the building. 20 years earlier, I had walked away from my old life carrying blame that was never fully mine. This time I walked away carrying proof. That was enough. I got in the car, and for the first time in 20 years I no longer felt the need to explain myself to anyone. I just held the key and left.